She didn't know I owned the building her brother's company was renting. I didn't correct her. I just smiled, picked up my coffee, and waited. That moment at the Christmas dinner table, my mother-in-law looking at me like I was something she'd tracked in on her boot. I had been waiting for it for 3 years. Not to be cruel, not to embarrass anyone. I just knew, the way you know when a foundation is solid or when it's going to crack, that the truth had a way of finding the surface eventually. You just had to be patient. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 years old. I live in Barrie, Ontario, about 90 minutes north of Toronto. I own a plumbing and HVAC company that I built from nothing, and I employ 14 people, most of them licensed Red Seal tradespeople who make more per hour than my brother-in-law does, managing a leasing office at a commercial real estate firm in Mississauga. I drive a Ford F-250. I own my house outright. I have a line of credit I've never had to use. None of that matters to my husband's family. What matters to them is that I wear steel-toed boots to work, and I sometimes come home with grease under my fingernails. My husband, Daniel, is the youngest of 3. His sister, Christine, is a dental hygienist in Oakville. His brother, Marcus, is the leasing manager I mentioned. Their mother, Patricia, worked as an administrative assistant at an insurance company for 30 years and retired with a very specific idea of what success looks like. It looks like a business casual wardrobe. It looks like a downtown condo with a gym in the lobby. It looks like a job title that sounds good at dinner parties. It does not look like me. Daniel and I met at a Tim Hortons in Barrie during a snowstorm in February. My truck had a slow tire, and I'd pulled in to call a friend, and he was already there, stranded, waiting for a tow because his car had slid into a curb on Dunlop Street. We talked for 2 hours while the storm moved through. He laughed at all my bad jokes. He thought it was interesting that I was a plumber. Not embarrassing, not unusual. Interesting. His family did not share that reaction. The first time I met Patricia, I was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt because Daniel had told me it was a casual dinner. It was not casual. Christine had a blazer on. Marcus was in pressed chinos. Patricia had clearly set the good dishes out. She looked at what I was wearing and said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Oh, you came straight from work." I hadn't. I'd gone home, showered, and changed. That was just what I looked like. At that dinner, she asked me about my job. I told her I ran a plumbing and HVAC company. There was a pause that lasted just slightly too long. Then she said, "That's interesting. Is it like a family business?" I told her no. I started it myself at 26. Another pause. She said, and then turned to Christine and asked about her dental hygiene program. That was the template for the next 3 years. Daniel and I got serious quickly. We moved in together after 8 months. He proposed on the dock at Kempenfelt Bay the following summer. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We got married at a small venue outside Collingwood. 40 guests. Simple. My side of the family cried. His mother wore a look the entire day like she was waiting for the punchline. What I noticed, slowly, was how his family talked to me versus how they talked to each other. Christine would call Daniel and they'd talk for an hour. Marcus would get long voicemails from Patricia about his career, his goals, whether he'd thought about the mortgage on a bigger place. When Patricia called me, which was rare, she asked things like, "Are you keeping busy?" The way you'd ask a teenager working a summer job. She asked Daniel about his career, constantly. He works in municipal planning for Simcoe County, which she found respectable. Good pension, benefits, stable. She'd say those 3 words like they were a prayer. Stable, stable, stable. She never seemed to understand that my company turned just over $1.2 million in revenue last year. Or maybe she did understand and it made her more uncomfortable, not less. The Christmas dinner incident started months before Christmas. In September, Marcus called Daniel to tell him he'd met someone. Her name was Lauren. She worked in commercial property development and had moved to the GTA from Calgary the previous year. She was, according to Marcus, exactly the kind of person Mom has always hoped one of us would end up with, which was his way of saying she had a corporate job and a master's degree. Patricia immediately began planning Christmas dinner around Lauren's arrival. I found this out not from Daniel but from Christine, who mentioned in passing that her mom was really pulling out all the stops because Marcus finally has someone serious. There had been no such stops for our wedding. In November, Daniel got a text from Patricia. She was very sorry, she said, but Christmas this year was going to be a smaller gathering, just immediate family and Lauren. She hoped we'd understand. She said the house was getting harder to manage with a big group, and she wanted Lauren to feel comfortable and not overwhelmed. I read the text over Daniel's shoulder. He put his phone face down on the counter. Neither of us said anything for a minute. Then I said, "How long have we been together?" He said, 4 years. I said, "Okay." I was not okay, but I knew better than to make that particular fight happen in my kitchen on a Tuesday night. I went to the garage. I had a half-finished quote to write up for a commercial job in Innisfil, a new medical clinic that needed full HVAC installation. I sat at my workbench, and I did the quote, and I did not think about Patricia or Marcus or Lauren, who had never met me and had already, by simply existing and being acceptable, pushed me out of a Christmas dinner. Daniel called his mother. I don't know exactly what was said, but I know his side of it, which was quiet and careful, and ended with him saying, "She's my wife, Mum." There was no resolution from that call. Patricia didn't change her position. She sent a Christmas card in December, with a gift card to winners inside, and a note that said she hoped Daniel and I were enjoying the season. We spent Christmas with my family in Sudbury. My dad made a 22-pound turkey. My aunt brought her famous butter tarts. My cousin's kids ran through the house and knocked over the nativity scene, and nobody got upset about it. It was loud and warm and easy. I didn't say anything about Patricia. My family knew things weren't perfect with his side, but I didn't perform my grievances. I ate my turkey, and I helped with the dishes, and I went to bed that night feeling okay. January came and went. February. Daniel and his mother had a strained few months. She called more often than usual. I think out of guilt, but the calls were surface level. "Fine, good, busy. Yes, it's cold. I know, the 400 was a nightmare this morning." In March, I got a call from a property development company about a significant contract. A new mixed-use development in Barrie's South End, residential units on top, commercial space below, 140 units total. It was the biggest single contract my company had ever been offered. We went back and forth for 6 weeks on the scope, the timeline, the price. I brought in my project manager, Tony, who'd been with me since year 2. We hired 2 additional licensed plumbers on contract. We started in May. The development company's site project lead was a woman named Lauren. I want to be clear about the timeline here, because it matters. I did not know, when I took that contract, that Lauren was Marcus's girlfriend. I had not met her. I knew her last name, Chen, from the contract paperwork, and it meant nothing to me. She knew my company name and my name from the contract. We had a professional relationship that was direct and efficient. She was good at her job. She didn't waste time in meetings. I respected her immediately. We worked together for 4 months before the connection surfaced. It surfaced at a site walkthrough in late August. Lauren and I were doing a progress check on the 2nd floor rough-in. We'd been on site together maybe a dozen times by that point. She knew I was married. I knew she was in a relationship. We'd made small talk over coffee at the site trailer. She was from Calgary. She missed the mountains. She found Barrie winters daunting but manageable. That morning, she mentioned she was meeting her boyfriend's family for Thanksgiving in October. She said she was nervous. She said his mother was particular. Something moved in the back of my mind. Particular. That was a very specific word. I asked, casually, where her boyfriend's family was from. She said Mississauga. I asked what he did for work. She said commercial leasing. I put my clipboard down. I said, "What's his name?" She said Marcus. I looked at her for a moment. She looked at me. Then she looked at my clipboard, which had my company name printed across the top. And then she looked back at my face, and I watched her make the connection in real time. She said, "Oh." I said, "Yeah." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, exactly, but was very full. She said, "He's told me about Daniel's wife. He said you work in trades." The way she said it, I could tell that's exactly how it had been described. Not she owns a company. Not she runs a crew of 14. Just, she works in trades. I said, "I own this contract we're standing on." She looked around at the second floor, at the rough-in work my team had done, at the copper lines running through the joists. She said, quietly, "I'm so sorry. About Christmas." I hadn't told her about Christmas, which meant Marcus had. I said, "You don't need to apologize for that." She said, "I didn't know. When Marcus mentioned it, I thought." She stopped. She said, "I should have asked more questions." I said, "It's fine." And then I picked up my clipboard and we went back to the walkthrough, because we were professionals and we had work to do. But I thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. Not with bitterness, exactly. With something more like clarity. She had been told a version of me. The version where I work in trades, where I'm an awkward fit for the family table, where it made sense, somehow, to exclude me from Christmas. And she had come to Barrie to oversee a major development project, and the company she'd trusted to do the plumbing and HVAC on a $24 million build was mine. Thanksgiving was the first week of October. Daniel was invited. I was also invited this time, because I think Patricia understood that after Christmas she was on thin ice with her youngest son. The invitation came in September, a phone call to Daniel, warm, enthusiastic, mentioning that she was looking forward to finally properly welcoming Lauren to the family. Daniel told me afterward. He looked at me carefully when he said it. I said, "Sure, let's go." We drove down to Mississauga on the Sunday. Patricia had the house decorated little gourds on the porch, a wreath on the door. Christine was there with her husband, Trevor. Marcus and Lauren were already inside when we arrived. Lauren saw me come through the door, and something crossed her face that I can only describe as carefully composed relief. She came over immediately and hugged me, which surprised everyone in the room, I think, including me. Patricia watched that exchange with an expression I couldn't fully read. Dinner was Patricia's traditional spread roast turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes with marshmallow, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce from a can, dinner rolls. I'd brought a butter tart pie from a bakery in Barrie, which my mother-in-law thanked me for, in the tone of someone who had not expected me to bring anything. The conversation at dinner followed its usual pattern for the first hour. Patricia asked Christine about a patient. She asked Marcus about a new property listing he was handling. She asked Trevor about his accounting firm. She asked Daniel about the county's official plan review. She asked me how work was going. I said work was good. Busy fall. She nodded and moved on. Lauren, sitting across from me, took a small sip of her wine. She didn't say anything yet. Marcus started talking about the commercial real estate market. He mentioned that new development builds were slowing because of financing conditions. He mentioned a development in Barrie's South End that was a big project mixed use. Lots of units. He said something like, "Whoever got those contracts is doing well." Lauren looked at her plate. I said, "That's ours." Marcus looked up. I said, "My company is the mechanical contractor on that build. We've been on site since May." The table was quiet. Patricia said, "Your company?" I said, "My plumbing and HVAC company. We have the full mechanical contract on the project." Christine said, "I didn't know you had a company." I said, pleasantly, "I started it 5 years ago." There was a long pause. The kind that has weight to it. Patricia said, "I didn't realize it was," and then she stopped and didn't finish the sentence, because any ending she could have put on it would have said something she probably didn't want to say out loud at Thanksgiving dinner. Marcus looked at Lauren. Lauren looked at her wine glass. Daniel reached under the table and put his hand on my knee. Not to stop me, just to be there. Patricia said, "Well, that's very impressive, Rachel." It was the first time in 4 years she had called me impressive. I said, "Thank you." And I meant it without sarcasm, because it genuinely was a good thing to hear, even if it was 4 years too late, and delivered with the slightly dazed quality of someone who has just realized they've been wrong. After dinner, while the men were watching the football game, and Christine was helping her mother with dishes, Lauren found me on the back porch. I was getting some air. October in Mississauga was mild that year. The neighbor's maple was full red. She sat in the chair beside me. She said, "I want to apologize again. For Christmas." I said, "Lauren, you really don't." She said, "No, I do. Because I could have said something when Marcus mentioned it. I thought it was strange. I didn't know you, but I thought it was strange that his brother's wife wasn't invited to Christmas. I went along with it. And I shouldn't have." I looked at the maple tree. I said, "You didn't know me." She said, "I know you now." There was a pause. Then she said, "For what it's worth, you run the tightest site I've worked with in the GTA. Your PM is excellent. And your crew's rough-in work is the cleanest I've seen on a build this size." I said, "I'll tell Tony you said that. It'll make his week." She laughed. It was a real laugh. I said, "For what it's worth, I don't hold it against you. You were navigating a family you were just getting to know. That's hard," she said. "It shouldn't have been a thing to navigate." I said, "No, it shouldn't have." We sat there for a few more minutes without talking. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just two people sitting with something that had been said. Before I went back inside, she said, "I'm going to say something to Patricia." I told her she didn't have to do that. She said, "I know I don't have to." I don't know what she said. I was inside helping with the pie by the time whatever that conversation happened. But I noticed that when we all sat back down for dessert, Patricia poured me my coffee first. Before Christine, before Daniel. She set it in front of me and said, "I made it medium roast. I hope that's okay." I said that was perfect. Driving home on the 400 that night, Daniel and I didn't talk much for the first stretch. The highway was quiet. I watched the lights of Barrie come up in the distance, and I thought about the first time I'd driven into this city, 23 years old, my tools in the back of a truck I'd bought for $11,000, a journeyman's ticket in my pocket, and no idea what I was doing yet. I thought about the first job I'd booked on my own. A hot water tank replacement in a bungalow in Innisfil, a retired teacher named Marg, who'd made me a sandwich while I worked, and told me she was glad I showed up when I said I would. $340. I drove home feeling like I'd won something. I thought about the day I registered the business name, the day I hired Tony, the day we crossed 100,000 in revenue, then 200, the day I signed the lease on our shop on Essa Road, the day we submitted the bid on the Barrie South End development, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot, afterward eating a coffee crisp, thinking, we might actually get this. Daniel said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You were great tonight." I said, "I didn't really do anything." He said, "That's what I mean." I looked out at the dark highway. The stars were out over Lake Simcoe. I thought about my dad, who spent 30 years as a millwright in Sudbury, and who told me, when I was 16 and said I wanted to learn the trades, that there was no better work than work you could see when it was done. Stand back and look at it. That's yours. Nobody can take that. I didn't need Patricia to call me impressive, but I'm not going to pretend it didn't mean something to hear. Not because I needed her approval, just because it's human to want the people in your life, even the difficult ones, to eventually see you clearly. She saw me. Finally. 4 years in, and one major Barrie development contract later, but still. Lauren and Marcus got engaged in December. She texted me when it happened. I texted back a congratulations and a suggestion for a good plumber if they ever bought a house in the GTA with a winking face. She replied with 3 laughing emojis and said I'd be the first call. Patricia called me the following week. First time she'd ever called me directly. She asked how I was. She asked how business was going. She said she'd been telling her friend at church about the development project. She said her friend was impressed. I said I was glad. She said, "I think I haven't always made you feel." And she stopped again, the same way she had at dinner. But this time I waited her out. She said, "I think I made some assumptions I shouldn't have." I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said, "Daniel loves you very much." I said, "I know. I love him too." There was a pause. Then she said, "Would you and Daniel want to come for Easter?" I said we'd be there. I wasn't ready to call it repaired. Some foundations, once cracked, take a long time to be trusted again. You patch them, you monitor them, you don't build a second story until you're sure. But I've learned, from years of looking at what's beneath things, that a crack doesn't always mean the structure is lost. Sometimes it just means it finally settled.